So the proof's in the pudding. It might be a little bit laborious. You might need to put some challenges in there and make it a bit more exciting sometimes for the players. But simple technique work shouldn't be ignored. It is part of the building block that you need.
What would be your advice for a brand new coach who's looking to plan and to deliver their first ever session? So where did they start?
Don't panic.
Yeah. I think, as we were discussing a bit earlier, is just to give them a ball. Make sure they have the ball for the whole hour. There are lots and lots of touches. And that can start with arrival activities, simple little turns and dribbles that they can use that they may have seen on telly or they're familiar with. And that can be easily done for 10 minutes, 15 minutes as a warm-up, with asking them, what one is your favourite turn or your favourite dribbling technique, and you'll get 3 or 4 goes at that, and then move on into the practice. I think following on from that, we were talking about, I don't want to steal all your thunder here.
No, go for it.
So the different types of practice formats that you can employ. So we often see a warm-up as running around either with or without a ball, and then they go in what we call up the steps. It might be small number game practices, some technical work, then into some opposed stuff, and then into a small-sided game. And the small-sided game almost is like a reward at the end, rather than we're building towards that because you can employ these things in the game, the things that we've been focusing in on. So we would very much advocate whole part whole. The kids arrive at different times, you get a game going, as it was on the streets many years ago. You arrive and you just say, right, you're on that team and you're on that team, and play. And that you'll get through 5 or 10 minutes. There's the warm-up as well. They don't need to do any formal warm-up. And then I think it's then breaking that down. Often kids arrive a bit giddy, don't they, for sessions, and they're not ready necessarily for learning. So therefore, just breaking or taking some of that energy out of them sometimes with a game, and that makes them then turn up probably the following week a little bit earlier, so that makes sure they're in the game for longer. Then going into some technical work or whatever it is, some small-sided opposed stuff that you might want to do for the learning focus, and then take that back into the game. How well can you now apply that in the game at the end? I think that's a great way for any age group to use.
Yeah, no, I'd just add to that in terms of real simplicity. Look at your hour, like how are you going to structure your hour? Pick a theme, topic, whatever you want to call it, that kind of runs throughout that hour. So can it link right through to your game at the end? So if you're doing, I don't know, if you've say been working on helping the players get better at passing or whatever it might be, what are kind of the rules, constraints you can add into that game at the end that really helps them still work on the passing element, so the game at the end don't just become kind of a game. There's still a little bit of learning that takes place within that. And then lastly, I'd go just have fun as a coach, like make sure you really enjoy it, because if the kids see you enjoying it, like they'll enjoy it. So yeah, that'd be what my couple of top tips.
Yeah. I think the other formats that you might want to employ is a carousel practice. But you probably need, depending on the age and stage of the players, you probably need at least 2 coaches and maybe a goalkeeper. If you've got the luxury of a goalkeeping coach, you can use a goalkeeping coach as well. But if you have maybe 2 or 3 stations and they break the players down into smaller numbers, and if the theme is passing, then there might be some technical work, then some opposed work within that carousel. So they're getting a flavour of different types of passing situations and passing techniques that they might need to use. But then take that into the game towards the end. And another one that I think works really well with younger players is a repetition circuit. So you're doing the same thing, but offset on 2 sort of areas. So often a good one is for defending and attacking is goalkeepers, offset, and a defender in each of those 2 pitches, and you might have 1v1s or 2v1 attacking, and then you can either work on the attacking or the defending. And all the players do, once the attacking players have finished, they go round and join the queue for the other, I wouldn't say queue, but a group to then go down the other side. Now you find that moves really quickly, and then you might keep the 2 players that are defending in for a set number of minutes or time, or if they win it back twice, then they come out and whoever's lost it become the 2 defenders. So it's there's different ways you can work with that, but that repetition circuit idea, I think it works really well. Kids like that.
Brilliant. Can you explain to us what the practice spectrum is and the pros and cons of each type of practice that you can put on?
Yeah, so the practice spectrum depends which end you start at. So we'll start at the unopposed end. So really simple and unopposed practice, which might be me and Chris just literally passing a ball backwards and forwards to each other. Then moving through to the unopposed but with interference. So again, me and Chris passing a ball backwards and forwards to each other, but we might have another pair that's passing their ball backwards and forwards. So we've got decisions to make of our timing of pass, but there's no threat on the ball. Nobody's going to take the ball off us. Then we move through to the overloads, underloads. So that could be high overloads, underloads, so it could be something like a 5v2 or 7v3, or it could be a 3v2 or a 4v3, or vice versa, 3v4, whichever way. But there's still that advantage for the team that's got the extra player right through to the top end of the spectrum, which is basically matched up. So that's more your game type scenario. So 4v4, 5v5, 3v3s, whatever it might be. And I think it's just understanding the trade-offs. So if you're working at the bottom end of the spectrum around the unopposed stuff, probably linking it to kind of the 6 capabilities that we've touched on, you're probably going to lose out on some of those capabilities. Going to get high repetition of techniques and technical outputs, but probably not going to get the scanning and that type of thing. Whereas obviously moving through the spectrum, when you go right up to the other end of the game, you're obviously going to get all those 6 capabilities that will naturally come out in the game. So I'm not sure there's any right or wrong. I think it's understanding, and again, we've spoke about this before, knowing the age and the stage of your player, that if I work here, these are the trade-offs. And I think the message from me would just be that if you've only got an hour, like, where do you want to spend most of your hour? What do you want your players getting better at and giving them the best experiences and the opportunities to get better at?
Anything to add to that, Org?
Yeah, I think this idea of technique, skill, small-sided game or game, that sort of breaks it down into the 3 main areas. But I was with the idea of unopposed practice. It's almost become a dirty word, and it isn't. You know, there's a definite room for unopposed practice. If players aren't particularly good at striking the ball, then they need to do that. I go to a club where the initial work when players arrive is to strike balls against the board, and you see them at 9, 10 years of age. They can strike a ball really well with either foot. So the proof's in the pudding. It might be a little bit laborious. You might need to put some challenges in there and make it a bit more exciting sometimes for the players. But simple technique work shouldn't be ignored. It is part of the building block that you need. And again, how much time you devote to that, you've got to be careful. And then, because as we've talked about the trade-offs, and then if you're going into opposed practice, then again, the challenge point of that, do I need to play against somebody that is probably a little bit not as good as me, so I get a lot of success sometimes, or I might be playing against somebody who's much bigger than me, and I'm quicker than that person. So there's little different challenges in size, height, maturation, etc. And then going into the games, then just being mindful that what is it about the game that you want to focus on to help them with the learning, and as Sam has alluded to, having a theme or a topic that you run with all the way through, so that the sessions or the practices link. Again, it makes sense to the kids. Then they can see how that builds up, and then when they get into the game, can they apply it in the moment? And of course, the more games you play, the more idea around picking up the 6 capabilities: scanning, position, movement, deception. All those things start to play out in your own mind as a player, and you can encourage those things. And if there's one of those things that might not be quite honed in some of the players, you might need to just have those conversations with the player about, well, what is it that you're actually perceiving? What are you seeing when you're starting to receive the ball? What are you trying to concentrate on? They might be just concentrating on the ball because that's what they're dealing with. In the modern game, at the top end, you've got to have this sort of perception and understand what you're going to do before you receive it. You don't have the time to get it and then decide what you're going to do with it most of the time.
How can you help players to begin to think, look and play forward?
Yeah, I think, again, I've said it before around like the practice design. that has to be key. So if we're wanting players to look, think, play, there has to be something to kind of to go to. So just going back to that, having goals, having targets, getting the practice design right. But I think part of it comes from the coach as well, the coaching behaviours, around encouraging that, around being brave, encouraging them to go forwards if they make a mistake, because a lot of the time if players are wanting to go forward maybe too quickly, maybe making the wrong decision at the wrong time, criticising that or shouting at that, is probably next time they're kind of not going to do it. So I think there's probably a two-way approach to this, from the coach's behaviours of encouraging it and giving the players confidence to do that, and their job as a coach is probably to help them recognise it when the time's right to do it, but again the practice design has to be right in allowing those things to happen and allowing the spaces and things to open up and playing towards a target or a goal or whatever it might be.
How can you alter your practice design then to encourage players to be creative?
I think in terms of practice design, like I say, I think that probably comes through a bit more constraints, rules, whatever you want to call it, in terms of a lot of being creative will be about staying on the ball, moving with the ball, trying to beat players. And again, it probably comes from the coach in kind of encouraging that. Different ways to score goals, so putting a constraint on. I know, like, we play it a few times with some of the little ones, like the football bingo, like there's a little chart and how many different ways can you score a goal. Every time you score by a certain way, you check it off the list, first one to kind of check all 6, 10 off, like you win the game. So I suppose that's starting to encourage children to use different parts of the foot, different parts of the body, to finish the ball. And then I suppose if you're looking at dribbling, is giving players little tasks of how many players kind of can they be in a certain phase, or being creative might be combining with teammates. Being creative might be different types of passes, so how many different passes can you use in a certain time frame. So I suppose it's giving the players enough variety to have a go at different things.
How would you help them then to potentially find space?
I think finding space is a tricky one, because sometimes it might be moving into the space. I think first of all it's recognising, so depending on again what age and stage you're working with, that will look very different from working with 5, 6, 7-year-olds to potentially a lot older players. So first of all, can they recognise it? What does space look like for a young player? Can they travel into it? How do they travel into it? But again, just making sure your practice allows that to happen. So if you're working in a square and it's too small, the trade-off's going to be there's probably not going to be as much space in working in something that's a lot bigger. So I'd certainly say the size of area helps with players in terms of finding that space. Sometimes it might be standing still. So actually me standing still, I'm in more space than if I run forwards 5 yards or backwards 5 yards. So again, just helping the players understand where that space is on the pitch and why you might move into that.
I think I'd like to chip in there. I think a great game to introduce them to finding space and creating space is futsal, because you have normally they either play a diamond shape or a 2 and a 2, and so you've almost got a square. But with a diamond shape, you've got somebody giving you depth, you've got the goalkeeper obviously behind them, and then you've got your 2 wide players that give you that movement up in the wide areas, so you're stretching the pitch as wide as you can, and then you've got a focal point up front to try and play into. So I think that gives the kids a real good understanding of how to sort of spread out and create space as an initial kind of format to play. I think, or even if it's just 5-a-side football, I think that's a great way of introducing the idea of finding space or creating space for yourself and others.
And would you say that's kind of, excuse me, a bit similar for like supporting and connecting and combining with players as well?
Yeah, I think they all interlink. I think there's obviously, if I move, then naturally I'm going to probably need some support. If I'm supporting someone, and then I'm going to need movement to be able to move the ball on. So I think all the principles interlink. I think the important thing to remember as a coach is you aren't going to cover them all in a session. I'd say if you're going to help the kids, help them with one thing and really try and concentrate on that. I think by throwing them all in the mix, it overcomplicates it for the players. But understand, like I say, that they do all interlink and intertwine. I
think that's why we try and keep to sort of 3 objectives for the session. press, cover and balance, I'll go back to defending, that makes it very simple and easy to remember, and you can reference those. You can put them on a board and write them up, and then keep referencing them as you're going through the session. I think a key principle as well is reward and recognition. So what gets rewarded and recognised gets repeated. So I think that's really, really important. And from a defending perspective, is to actually recognise and reward success, because when those things happen, it gets repeated. So in rewards and recognition, so you might be specific about what you're saying. Well done, John, that was a great tackle, or that was a great interception. Encouraging those things, and then the reward of maybe scoring a goal or doing something creative, a counter-attack, incentivise the players to want to do it again.
In your opinion, what should practices look like if we want to develop skillful players?
Opportunities to make lots of decisions, opportunities to experience those principles that we spoke about earlier in terms of that attack and defence. Spoke about earlier again around having that goals, opposition, direction, put those three things in, naturally a lot of the other things will come out. Again, I spoke about coaches' behaviour and how they perceive skillful players and how they encourage that and how they create that environment for them to feel positive, to want to have a go at things. I think sometimes skillful we can look at in kind of, we'll go your Ronaldos, your Messis, your really skillful players, when I think there's a real kind of skill in some of our defending that we do as well. So just alluding to some of Chris's, the principles that we spoke about, I personally think delays are a real skill. Like, you have to be a really skilled player to understand like the body shape, how you're going to stop that, but try and affect that at the same time, having an eye on where your mates are, how much longer have I got to do this for until I get a little bit of help. So I think, just coaches having an understanding that skillful players works across both attacking and defending. Mm.
Yeah, and I'll support that, what Sam's just said there. If from a defending perspective, rewarding and again recognising good play in terms of defending, pressing, knowing when to press and how to press, knowing when to cover, when to have a bit of balance, when to communicate, and all those capabilities around scanning and positioning, movement, deception, techniques. So, and again, I'd go back to the techniques and try to hone in on those not as much as, but devote some time to the techniques if they're not quite right, so that they're a building block. Any team that wants to achieve their sort of tactical ambitions have to have technically good players. So, don't ignore them.
Can you talk us through how to use targets then in your practice design? So what options do coaches have and what influences the type of target that they might use?
I think the go-to is probably when we talk about targets is goals. And when I talk about a goal, I talk about 2-post crossbar. Unfortunately, grassroots clubs don't have access to kind of goals in terms of what we perceive as a goal. Obviously, if you're going to use a goal, usually the end product is a shot, strike, finish, whatever you want to call it. Whereas I think the different types of targets that you can use probably produce a different end goal, if that makes sense. So if you think about using a target player, that might be, so the end product is a pass. So can I find Jamie's feet by a pass? That can be included in rotation. So to score, I've got to get the ball into Jamie, I drop out, Jamie runs in. So we're looking at them passing and receiving skills. But it's directional, and that's how we score. We're going to a target. I suppose you can have stationary targets, moving targets, so the players on the end could be able to move. So then you're looking at supporting angles. So when I get in a position, can Jamie move to a position where it's a better position for him, her to get on the ball? End zones are great in terms of, again, a direction, a target to go to. The end product might be the pass and the time in a run. So to score this time, I've got to arrive in the end zone the same time that the ball arrives from a pass. So again, looking at that timing. And then I suppose the last one for me would be maybe around end zones or end lines. And it might be a dribble and moving with the ball. So to score, I've got to dribble this ball over the line. So 3 or 4 different targets there in terms of goals, players, end zones, end lines, kind of with very different outcomes in terms of an end product.
Yeah, very similar. I mean, there's end lines, there's targets, there's goals, there's number of passes possibly if you're looking to keep possession and build the attack. So yeah, there's a number of different ways you can reward and have outcomes to the theme.
What ways can coaches bring all these practices and activities together? If we want to start with explaining the whole approach first, and then we'll work through.
Well, we've touched on it before around. So it might be something you start the session with because kids are arriving at different times. Or you might not been able to get on the pitch and set up properly, so you get them into a game while you probably getting your this sorted out or whatever. So, but the kids just like to arrive and play a game. They might, as we've said, they might come along a bit giddy and they just need to run around and burn off a bit of energy. And then they might be ready for a little bit more sort of formal practice. And then there'll be a theme to that. And then can they then go back into another game where they can apply some of that learning? And it's just coaching and managing that process, really.
Sam, if you want to talk to us a little bit and tell us a bit more about the carousel approach.
Yeah, so I suppose the carousel approach is giving players an opportunity to kind of have a go at some different things in terms of like a carousel. And I suppose it depends, we spoke about earlier around picking your theme, so kind of what does that look like? What are you really trying to help the players with their learning in that hour session? Might be 2, it might be 3, it might be 4, depending on obviously the space that you've got available, the number of players that you've got available, and then rotating around kind of different stations that give them an opportunity if you're working on, I don't know, turning, that each activity as an opportunity to practice some of these kind of turning techniques, if you like.
And then finally, can you talk us through the up the steps approach?
So that's been the traditional way to manage a coaching session. They come in, you do a technique, and then that goes into a skill or an opposed practice, and then that morphs into a game. So again, linking it to a theme so that there is some linkage and the players understand why they're doing the techniques, and then the decision making in the opposed stuff becomes greater than in the game, when and where to do things.
Anything else to add to that all?
Not really. I think there's been opportunities with coaches to work the other way. So we talk about up the steps. Don't know if it's right to go down the steps, but we have spoke previously on different courses and things like what happens if you start with a game, but you kind of work backwards. So sticking with the theme, but you work down as opposed to up, which I know some coaches have experimented with. I think variety is key. I think giving the players a mixed diet of different styles of activities, what they do, how they do it, will really help them. I think that varied diet is probably one of the biggest things that we're really sort of keen on, to help support the players, develop skillful players in terms of what we're going after.